Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about album number 8 from µ-Ziq, Chewed Corners. Okay, this is technically the last project I have left from the Paradinas album back catalog to review, though it's not quite the end of the series yet, not just because I'm gonna have to do an odds and ends, a top 10 and a worst to best ranking, but also because he's coming out with his 11th proper album called 1977 in like 2 weeks, which I'm obviously going to be covering as well. And given the inevitable ridiculous amount of work that will have to go into the odds and ends, chances are I'm gonna be getting to the new album first before I get into any of those other videos. But anyway, for this video we're going back to 2013. It had been a few years since he released his single Darkest album in Born Abbott's Soulmate Devastation Technique, which was basically the IDM version of a horror movie soundtrack. But at this point in his life, he was in a much healthier place. He'd gotten married to Lara Rix Martin, and had even been making some music in collaboration with her around the time as part of the duo Heterotic. And along the way, he was inspired to get back to a bit of solo music making on his own time, eventually resulting in this 8th album of his, which went in as far in the opposite direction of his last album as one could get, replacing all the brooding and miserable soundtracky compositions with some of his brightest and happiest work to date. And while Paradinas had gone into making it without any conscious influences, he looked back on what he'd done and was reminded of the likes of Rusty, The Art of Noise, Orbital, Japan, Kuwaido, the Chicago footwork scene, and of course Aphex Twin. And as you might be able to tell from the fact that I sprung for the CD of this one, Chewed Corners, I think, might be my personal favorite of the later period µ-Ziq albums. I always found its bright and melodic approach to be really instantly charming and likable, and very easy to get myself wrapped up in, and not to mention, perhaps unlike later albums of his such as last year's Magic Pony Ride, which might have borrowed more from like old school breakbeat formulas, and could feel like more of a throwback, Chewed Corners is definitely not an album that wishes to dwell on the past. It feels a lot more in line with what was currently going on in the underground electronic scene, especially given all the trap-influenced beats that show up through several different tracks, and occasionally some of the future bassy synth textures that he ended up using. He noted Rusty as an influence, and I can definitely hear that. But at the same time, it also doesn't feel like he's trend-chasing either. Back in the day when I first heard this album, circa 2015-ish, I was extremely against the use of trap beats or anything resembling them in anything, because I hadn't yet recovered from the overexposure of the Harlem Shake. If I detected trap beats anywhere back then, it would have been an instant negative. And somehow I don't think I even noticed those influences here at all back then, despite their being so obviously present when I go back to listen to this now. Which I think is a real testament to the quality he had on display. This is an album that both feels modern, but also feels kinda timeless. Right from the way this thing starts with opener Taikon, you're let in on exactly the kind of album you're getting into. A very light and breezy, friendly lead melody, eventually getting joined by some thunderous bass and some old school drum machines that have a tiny bit of that trap flavor, and getting joined by all these other warm pads and arpeggios. If you listen to this right after Born Abbott's, the contrast will be extremely stark. It's just very nice and welcoming, and the melodies are bright and happy without feeling cheesy. Even when the hi-hats start going into hyperspeed and there's some synth choirs joining in the background, that only serves to accentuate the typical playful edge that you would probably already expect out of Paradinas. And much of the rest of the album focuses on pretty much the same sound palette while playing around with it in various shapes and patterns. For instance, Christ Dust has the same avalanches of skittering hi-hats and retro drum machines, which start to have a little more of like an 80s electro feel, but going up next to all these lush flute-like melodic pads and intense fuzzy bass stabs, eventually paying off in the middle with this rollicking bass arpeggio that feels like it shifts the pace of the entire track in a pretty epic way. Or you also got a track like Wipe, which has all these wobbling synth leads with a few different layers of keyboard accompaniment that feel slightly disorienting until the big 80s bass line comes in and reveals itself to have been the hook all along. Even an interlude like Moneth feels like it adds a different flavor that fits well in its mixes of more eerie bass and harp plucks. This cut low-key kinda feels like an idea he could have ended up doing on Magic Pony Ride years later. It sounds like the track Magic Pony Ride, I guess. Next up, there's Twangle Melkas, which itself kind of invites some level of hype thanks to the similarity in title to one of the most popular tracks from Bluff Limbo, Twangle Front. This track is not as good as that one, and I don't think it's really comparable to it. But it's still definitely a highlight in its own right, focusing on all these standard trap beats with progressions of synth organs and choir melodies that give the track a particularly austere but still playful edge to everything. It's like having a rave at a church or something, and that's kind of a funny image. And this track leads quite cleanly into the following cut, Melting Bass? I don't know. One of the more melancholy sounding cuts in its mix of marching bass arpeggios and fluttering synth melodies, going up next to the lead minor key keyboard plinks. This is a track I initially wasn't huge on, but I do think it has one of the more unique melodic blends, while also transitioning very well out of its surrounding tracks. Definitely a grower there. And after that, we get an even bigger highlight in Houzz 10. And if you guessed that this was more of a house cut, well, yeah. That was a pretty interesting one that builds itself out of like these deep stabbing bass chords, clattering IDM percussion that only later starts to form into more of a standard house pattern, some Italo house pianos, and of course the choirs that come in every 8th or 16th beat to really further a sense of expansive atmosphere. There's so many treble-heavy melodic patterns flying around throughout this track that can often blend together a bit and end up in a bit of an incoherent cloud, but they still go together really well, like mixing a bunch of paints together. Feeble-Minded, meanwhile, contrasts the very uplifting and pretty tones of the previous tracks with a cut that features the most intense bass progressions out of any cut here. The bass here is super raw and aggressive, but still underscores lots of similarly pretty melodic pads and later some clattering 808s. Feels like a darker moment for the album and just feels like this really impressive wall of sound. The kind of thing which after it finishes might leave you wanting to step back and take a little bit of a breather. And that breather is sort of provided by the following cut, Hug, which is made out of a lot of the same ingredients as the previous tracks, but takes a comparatively understated approach. With its layers of melodic lines and synth choirs feeling a bit more reserved, and its bass taking on a bit more of like a lower key plunking texture that still weirdly has a little bit of an interesting late 80s flavor to it, I guess. Though next there's Mountain Island Boner, which has always been one of my most consistent big favorites on the album, thanks to how it interpolates some melodies from the Alan Parsons Project Sirius, of all things. It feels like it's taking all the ingredients from that track, like the dramatic keyboard leads, do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do, and some pianos serving the same purpose as the big guitar stabs in the original, but kind of switching around some of the placements of the notes so that it still ends up feeling like its own thing separate from the original. Like it's playing some sections out of sync from each other and building a wholly new track out of them, especially when new melodic leads that weren't in the original or some lighter and more refreshing chord progressions that come in like halfway through are introduced. Making an Alan Parsons reference at all was already an automatic win on its own, but Paradinas really took that classic iconic album intro and made it into something that he can call his own, which is no small feat. Next up we got Tickly Flanks, which I sort of see as like an upside-down mirror to Feeble-Minded. This one has all these treble-heavy, almost organ-like, Eurodance-ish synth chords that seem to match the intensity of Feeble-Minded's bass. That cut is pretty epic whenever it comes up. And it is followed by two more chill tracks, which tend not to stick out to me as much. Smooch, of course, feels like it's acting as a companion to the earlier track Hug in its comparatively more understated approach, though it's not quite as satisfying or necessary at this point on the album. I guess the melodies on this one feel a bit quirkier and jokier in comparison to that track, but not in comparison to most of the other cuts here. 10 just sits there not really standing out in the grander scheme of the project. Gunnar is a better, more chill moment that has a thicker mix of melodic patterns that are covered in a fair bit more reverb for that greater sense of open space, and end up making the entire cut feel like one of the colder and more melancholy moments for the album. Bit more attention-grabbing in the track it follows, and very nice, as everything else, though still not necessarily striking to the point of being a major standout. But as nice as everything on this album has been, all of it has fit together well, created a well-textured journey through lots of different, very pretty melodic textures and patterns, felt very bright and colorful. But all 13 other moments on this album are completely overshadowed by the final track on this album, the 7-minute opus that is Weakling Paradinas. This album has been plenty solid up to this point, but this track takes it to a whole different level, and feels almost kind of like a return to some of the build up lots of sounds on top of each other formulas that he liked exploring back in the days of Bluff Limbo. At first it starts small with all these very low-key plinking melodic leads going over a steady techno kick, adding on some light and icy keyboard licks, adding on some fuller sounding percussion patterns and warm pads to fill out the mix a little more. Some house pianos are slowly faded in to join in, some tambourines and cowbells, and then the sub bass hits, followed by these huge sounding 80s bass stabs which somehow amp up the energy even further. And just when you think this cut couldn't get any more epic, the track brings back those flashy Eurodance chords like the ones on Tickly Flanks to really make everything feel so extra and over the top in the way all my favorite Paradinas tracks are. And the track does take breather moments to isolate some of the various moments or even go a little ambient in parts, but goes back to build them right back to those transcendental heights all over again, and it even starts to make me tear up from sheer unbridled epicness. I have no freaking words for Weakling Paradinas. It isn't just the best track on the album by far, but it's one of the best tracks Paradinas has ever made in his life. At least in like the top 3, right up there with the likes of Gobbots and Swan Vesta, and might just raise my score of the entire album a half point all by itself. And again, the rest of the album was still really good even without it. Chewed Corners is a complete whole as an album that feels like it's keeping up with what was then the modern scene of electronic music, without either relying on techniques that might feel like a retro throwback, or without feeling trendy, which has helped all of it to age remarkably well. I would get it if some people felt like it ran together a bit for their liking. A lot of tracks can explore pretty similar ideas without standing apart from each other, but it still feels sufficiently varied to me, with plenty of standouts that really pull me in, even ignoring the ending that curb stomps literally everything else. I think that's pretty much all I have to say about Chewed Corners. I think it is still a fresh listen, a decade after its release, and while it may not be a Tango Invective or a Bluff Limbo level classic, I think it's able to stand out as one of my favorite studio albums he has put out, which leads me to overall feel an 8.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.